Welcome to today's video where we get to talk about deaths, expected deaths, and excess deaths. We take a deep dive into the way the CDC measures excess deaths, approaching the measurements from three independent perspectives to show that the official CDC numbers are high by 1,000 excess deaths per week, which will amount to a substantial error of 40,000 extra excess deaths reported by the CDC at the end of 2020. We walk through this analysis using three main figures. The first is the CDC weekly deaths blue bar chart, which I'm sure you've seen on their site. The chart is replotted in line form and extended. Then each year is stacked one on top of the other to come up with a year-over-year profile of a proper expected deaths curve. Let's start back on the CDC page and go through these figures one by one. These blue bars show that in the United States, averages about 55,000 deaths per week with dips in the summer and outbreaks in the winter. The orange line is what the CDC calls the 2 standard deviation threshold. Anything above the orange threshold is declared an outlier and gets a little tiny cross. The orange line is 2 standard deviations above this black dashed line, the main focus of this video. For some reason, the CDC does not show it on their webpage, but it is the CDC's expected deaths line, and any deaths above this line are excess deaths. We will investigate and modify this line. Replotting the blue bars chart in line form, we get this graph where I use data from mortality.org to extend weekly deaths back to 2013. The expected deaths line for 2020 is the same dashed line we saw on the blue bars chart. The average of the CDC line is the green square. One can pretty much see how the CDC came up with this average. Each black dot is the average deaths for that year. Following the green line, deaths go up and up, then peak before decreasing ever so slightly in 2019. Following the curve, it's not a stretch to say the average for 2020 should be the green square. But there's much more going on in this graph. I'll give 3 independent arguments plus a bonus one why the 2020 CD expected deaths line should be shifted upward by 1,000, and the yearly average should be this red square. The first argument for the shift is dry tinder, or fish in a pond. The second uses the average of the dips to show such a trend. And the third, 2020 began with a shelf similar to the shelves in 2016 and 19. Therefore, 2020 expected deaths should follow these 2 years closely. Remember, for reference, COVID did not strike until this point right here. First, I love the way these lines reveal fish in a pond behavior. Fish in a pond is a basic chaos concept which ties into the famous Mandelbrot set. If you have a lot of fish in a pond one year, they eat most of the plants. Next year, with little to eat, their population shrinks. With fewer fish, more plants grow, allowing the fish population to once again increase. This cyclical behavior can be seen in our COVID deaths graph. This solid red line is a lag line, representing the average number of deaths in the previous 52 weeks, and the red dashed line is there to guide your eye. In 2014, lagging deaths are low, meaning in the previous year there were fewer deaths than anticipated. This leaves additional deaths available for the next year, which is exactly what the next year shows, more deaths. The concavity of the green line is at this point is upward. Then in 2015, we have more lagging deaths than anticipated, and the green line is concave downward. As we move along, we have concave up, concave down, and the CDC anticipates a slightly concave downtrend into 2020. But that's not what our fish in a pond tell us. Just like in 2014 and 16, in 2019, lagging deaths are low, so 2020 expected deaths should be higher. How much? Well, that's a guess. But from 2014 to 2015, the average jumped 1,500 deaths. And from 2016 to 17, the average jumped 1,300 deaths. So a 1,000 death jump to our red square is well justified, meaning the CDC point and its corresponding expected deaths line is low by about 1,000. Second, we observe that the yearly averages include data above and below the green line. Above the green line, data is chaotic, which does not allow for an accurate trend line. Below the green line, that's nice and smooth. Let's use these summertime dips to construct a trend line. Averaging weeks 15 through 47 of each year gives us the lower green line. These yearly averages are less variable and clearly show a higher expected death trend into 2020, backing up our fish in a pond prediction. Again, how many expected deaths? 10 methods will give 10 different results, but they will all show an upward trend. And the red square representing an increase of 700 deaths into 2020 is a fair extrapolation. The lower green square is the CDC's expected deaths line averaging from weeks 15 through 47, which predicts a downward trend into 2020 and is again about 1,000 deaths below the red square. The similarity of the dips then can be used to our advantage. Using the dip averages as offsets, we take one curve, stack it on the next, and so forth to come up with an expected deaths line for 2020. The year-over-year graph does just that. Each thin line is one of the 2013 to 2019 years adjusted to the average of each line over weeks 15 through 47 is equal. The week-by-week average of the thin lines is the green dashed line, and the yellow shaded area is plus or minus 2 standard deviations. As a quick aside, placing the 2 standard deviation yellow shaded area from the year-over-year graph on top of the blue bars chart, we see the smaller summer and larger winter variance. We also see that a number of the red crosses are not outliers, and the CDC should not list them as such. This is significant when trying to understand excess deaths. In the year-over-year graph, the green dashed line provides the general shape of expected deaths. The red dashed line averages only years 2016 and 19, which are each represented as thin red lines. The shelves of 2016 and 19 are adjusted to match the beginning shelf of 2020. They begin the year flat before lilting into the summer months. Perhaps these 2 years provide the most accurate bellwether of things to come in 2020 sans COVID. Next, we bring in the CDC expected deaths line, which is again the same dashed line as we see on the blue bar graph. The key focus of this entire graph is at week 11 or March 14th, Pi Day. Before this point, there are essentially 0 COVID deaths. After this point, deaths rapidly increase. The CDC line is noticeably low, but shifting it up by 1,000, we get the gray dashed line, which matches our red and green lines on March 14th. It must be noted that though 1,000 is a nice round number, we use it solely because it fits the data. Let's pause here to look at what we're actually measuring. To measure COVID's impact on 2020, we want to compare excess deaths to COVID deaths. That's the whole point. In other words, we want the expected deaths line to go through this March 14th point right here. If the expected deaths line does not go through this point, from the start it will include excess deaths unrelated to COVID. Comparing apples to apples, all expected deaths curves must go through this point. The shifted CDC line accurately predicts excess deaths past March 14th. It cannot be overemphasized that any analysis using the CDC's black line must stipulate that when COVID struck, the CDC curve was already measuring 1,000 excess deaths per week, and these 1,000 weekly deaths have absolutely nothing to do with COVID or any COVID-related activity. That is, of course, unless it can be proven otherwise. This completes our trifecta of insisting that the CDC line is low by 1,000 deaths per week. We've shown this through fish in a pond, dips in the lines, matching shelves, and as a bonus by suggesting the deaths line must go through the COVID point. From here, it matters little whether we use the green, red, or gray dashed line. So let's measure. The CDC states that overall, an estimated 299,000 excess deaths occurred from late January through October 3rd, with 198,000 deaths attributed to COVID. Again, comparing apples to apples, the CDC should be measuring from when COVID struck, March 14th. From March 14th through October 3rd, the black CDC line gives 294,000 excess deaths. Subtracting the 198,000 COVID deaths, we get 96,000 non-COVID deaths. The gray, green, and red lines each give about 30,000 fewer deaths, which is a substantial 1/3 of the non-COVID deaths listed by the CDC. To accurately analyze COVID in 2020, the gray, green, red line, or something similar must be used to calculate excess deaths. That wraps up this analysis. All in all, this is a morbid subject. Thank you for taking time to watch the video. Feel free to comment below or contact me with questions. Be safe out there. We live in a COVID world.